Rob, your philosophy when you're teaching is the world is our classroom. This feels more relevant now than ever before. What was that moment that sparked that philosophy and shifted the way that you teach, and why was that?
Well, it actually comes back to even before I was a teacher. My first degree is actually in outdoor adventure leadership at Laurentian. And so it was like my whole passion for my life has been outdoors, being active. And when I started teaching, in order to be sort of legitimate to the students, I had to bring in my own passion, right? Because the students respond so much to passion rather than just, information. And so I saw the importance of teaching them not just about the content, but about the content in the context of the greater world. And I also realized that students are having less and less experiential opportunities as they move into using everything on technology. It's like when I grew up, you looked around the communities and everyone was outside playing, whereas now you barely see any kids outside playing, or if you do, they're on their phones, they're playing video games, right? So there is a big disconnect that I saw to the actual bigger real world. And by not experiencing that, then they limit their own experiences. And so they also then limit where they go in the future.
One of the reasons I am so excited to speak with you is that you are in the classroom every day and have been doing this for more than 2 decades. And you're seeing the students, you're seeing how they learn. And like you just mentioned, I certainly see this with my own son, where they're spending more and more time online, and there's lots of benefits of technology. But along the way, you kind of lose that perspective of where the things that we have in our lives, where that stuff comes from, how it's made. Can you talk a little bit about how you're able to bridge that gap between ensuring that young people, of course, have the digital skills and tech knowledge that they need when they go into the workforce, but also understand the real world systems that power that?
Yeah, I've really noticed a growing disconnect between students and their stuff, right? So when I first started teaching, where technology wasn't as sort of embedded in their daily life, they would be out, they would have fun, they would do stuff, they would see where things were coming from. And then with just the sort of the growth of the sort of the social media, they've basically had their lives curated in terms of what they think and what they see. And if it doesn't match their current interests, they don't get exposed to it. And so there's like a growing disconnect between the items that they love and they have and where they actually come from. And it's come up a number of times. Like in chemistry class, for example, ask the students where the chemicals come from, and they're focused on, well, they come from the storage cupboard. And I'm like, oh, okay, no, before that. And then they're like, well, the company that you guys bought them from. And I went, okay, and before that. And they went, I don't know. And so there was that big real disconnect. And it's about not just about the chemicals, but it's about everything. They stop thinking about where something comes from at the sort of the store level. And so without that sort of appreciation of where things come from, they sort of lose that disconnect to the greater world. So one of the things that I actually did in my class is, started trying to address that stuff. So I brought in my mineral and collection from sort of home. And so when I start talking about, a chemical, if I have a sample of that chemical in its natural form, where it actually came from, I can hold it up, I can pass it around, I can let them actually sort of touch it of, yeah, this doesn't look like that liquid that we see in the container. I'm like, no, this is how it comes out. And it's like that for, even things like, the table salt. A lot of kids are just blown away by the fact that that is a mineral that is extracted from the ground. And so when I show them, a piece of, fairly large halite, which is sodium chloride, they are just, they don't believe me until I'm like, yeah, go ahead. You can lick that one. And then they lick it and they're like, oh my God, it's salt. And, so, trying to bring them back to where does everything come from? So like what's in your cell phone, for example, Most of them go, well, electronics. And it's like, okay, great. What is in those electronics? And then you start realizing, the dozens and dozens and dozens of different minerals in there and where they actually came from. It starts really kind of seeing a bigger sort of experience in terms of their acceptance. So instead of, oh, I need to get the newest and greatest, I've actually seen a lot of students go, I actually like this device, I'm going to keep working with it rather than just get the new one when the new version comes out, which unfortunately seems to be the sort of the trend.
I imagine as you're showing students where stuff comes from, that it also opens their eyes to potential new career opportunities, because all of a sudden, they may realize that there is a whole world beyond just becoming an influencer or a YouTube star, some of the things they see as career options in the digital space. So when you're talking to these students, how important is it that you are exposing them to these other career options, and what is their reaction to this?
Well, it's funny because I do it on a lot of different levels. And in one aspect, so for example, I'm teaching math, you go, okay, we are going to take this data and we are going to, find a model, whether it's a linear or quadratic. And they just look at a data set and they go, okay. And they're thinking, why am I doing this? Why do I care? But then I've sort of flipped that. And instead of, here's the data set, I give them, some simulated drill core, and I'll explain the story of where that would have come from. So a geologist, went out there, thought that there's an ore body here, so we have drillers that go down and they drill in, they extract it, and then detect. And so I give them the story of here's where this came from, and then I actually have them, measure from on my little simulated fake drill core down to the layer that we're interested in, collect that layer, so they're actually making the connections between why we care about this, and then coming up with that data and then using that data to model. So it's showing them the career, it's giving them application, but it's also allowing them to sort of use whatever skill I'm trying to get them to learn in the context of other skills. And like, students will not go into a career unless they're aware of it. And you can see that when you talk to like young kids. It's like, what do you want to be? And everything that they want to be is things that they have been like very clearly exposed to. And so something that they have never thought about is not going to be on their mind. So I've sort of taken it upon myself to show them as many different careers as I can, either, very explicitly of, hey, we're going to learn about this career, or in giving students applications to the work that I actually want them to do, to show them some examples of where the information is used, where it's applied, and the careers that sort of go into that. So it kind of builds that career into the back of their mind so that they're at least now aware of it.
What is their reaction when you talk about some of these other career options, whether it's in mining or beyond?
It's really varied. So if I start off and just kind of start talking about mining, a lot of them initially sort of kind of like, oh boy, because their understanding, and basically I have noticed that a lot of people's understanding of, for example, the mining sector is decades. And I'm not talking, 1, 2, 3. I'm like 5, 6, 7 decades out of date, So when they think mining, they're still thinking of that, sort of the old 1920s, 30s underground. Everything's dirty, done by hand. And so they've got this sort of disconnect. So I've sort of approached it more from not saying, a miner, but the different careers in the mine. So I'm kind of breaking that of anyone who's in mining is doing exactly the same thing to different aspects to show them, we've got, well over 100 different careers in mining and completely different career paths, right from, the trades all the way up through, the scientific and geotechnical and technical, and then the electronics and the, computers, all the way up to the sort of executives and financial.
You have really been blazing this amazing path when it comes to space and earth science in the classroom. What is the hardest sell for you, and what would you like other educators to learn to be able to follow your lead?
The hardest sell for me is just getting over sort of the people's initial sort of um, bias or what they think, space science or geoscience or mining is all about. Because again, a lot of them very out of date, don't really understand it, don't understand the broader implications, and they don't actually see the connections to themselves. So every time I'm trying to sort of push to either get sort of funding, to get sort of time out of the class to do these other things, there's always an element of I have to educate the people about the realities before I can actually go ahead and do what it is that I want to do. And as I do that, it does get easier and easier. Right. When I first started this, for example, at my school, and something simple like, what courses are you taking next year in high school? And you get to the science teachers and they're all, yeah, we can take the wonderful science of biochemistry and physics. And I'm going, hello, there's also the environmental science that we teach, the astroscience, the geosciences. And so it's taken a lot to, get to the point where they're starting to go, oh yeah, and you can also take this class with Mr. Millard or whatever. And so then now so in my school, it's been quite a long journey, but there's still a lot of pushback that I get. And every time I get a new administration, I have to start over again. So
as you are teaching the students, I can imagine over the years that you've had such a unique perspective. And I imagine something special happens when you're teaching a student and they have that aha moment where they recognize that, okay, this could be my future. I didn't really know about these different types of earth sciences or environmental sciences. Can you walk us through some of those experiences that you've had or moments where you've seen that light bulb go off with your students?
Well, it's funny because some of the light bulbs don't go like boom and blinding light. Some of them are this slow increment that happens. Like, for example, when I'm teaching a grade 12 Earth and Space Science, I usually ask the kids, hey, who has a rock collection, mineral collection, fossil collection? And like 90% of them kind of roll their eyes. They're like, oh, that's so lame, Mr. Millard. But it's funny because then by the end of the course, they're like arguing of who has the better collection because, I've taken them out in the field. We've seen this stuff. And so, they started collecting, they're taking photographs. I've actually had a couple of them like saying, my mom won't let me drive the car anymore. I'm like, well, why not? Did you crash? They're like, no, every time I do, when I go past a rock cut, I slow down and I look at it and they're in a rush to get wherever. And like, I hear those things and I'm just like, oh my God, that's like amazing. But then there's other things that are just all of a sudden you do get that big light bulb moment, right? So for example, I had one student that his light bulb was that moment he licked the halite in my class and went, oh my God, this is table salt. This is where this came from. And so he started looking at where everything else was coming from. And so he, 3 days later, he came back to me. He's like, do you know that there's over 30 minerals in my phone? I'm like, yeah. But he was just so excited about that. And he's like, do you have any of these? And so then the next thing you know, he's going through my collection, trying to see them all. So that's been nice. But then it's also been really nice of, these students who, go out of my class and normally you don't really interact with them that much, right? Once they leave the school, it's very rare that you have students coming back. And over the years, I've had a number of students who've come back and, hey, Mr. Millard, guess what? I'm like, what? And they're like, I got a job and I'm working for a mining company. I'm like, oh, cool. And so I've had a lot of students who, they're not mining, they're doing all sorts of those other careers that they would never have thought of, but they do think about it because, there's one that went into finance. And so he's going to be a banker. Well, now he lives downtown Toronto working for sort of the finance sector of the mining company. And so he's like, I never would have like looked for that. And he's absolutely loving his job, and it's like that for a bunch of things. Like I have another student who was going to be, a cop, then realized didn't really want to be a cop, but ended up getting a job for security for a remote mine and is absolutely loving the lifestyle. Right. So they're taking the path that they want, but the fact that they're open to working with sort of the mining companies now, which never would have been on their plate, which is absolutely wonderful. And I just had last week, I actually found out that one of my students, currently in grade 11, was, thinking about engineering, thinking about this, thinking about that. Had this conversation with his mom about 2 months ago, and the mother just shared it with me that he is going to go and he is going to be a mine engineer. And so he's like now planned everything out from here on. And so like I was excited to hear about that. I had one student who was just like crying after her exam on Wednesday. And I'm like, oh my God, are you okay? Was the exam horrible? She's like, no, I'm going to miss this. Like, I love talking about, where stuff comes from. And, I've never realized so much. And I'm like, so that was good for me.
Wow.
That felt great.
It is amazing, and I can imagine that it's your sense of curiosity as well in the classroom that helps your students to picture these careers in mining or other industries. I know you've been in so many mines. I myself am impressed that I've been in one in Nickel Rim South with Glencore, and it was such an incredible experience. But you've had more than just that one experience. So could you walk me through some of those experiences and how it has really helped you open your eyes and be more curious about the careers that do exist for your students?
Yeah, it's funny because back when I used to teach 7 and 8, and then I switched to teaching high school, and then I realized there was an Earth and Space class, and I really wanted to teach it. So I pushed and pushed, and then I realized that, ooh, wait a minute. If I'm going to be teaching this, I need to up my own knowledge and comfort because, I do have a fairly solid sort of background, but I wanted to really, make sure that I'm really comfortable. So I started looking for opportunities to learn about, geosciences, mining, whatever. And I came across the mining tour. The first mining tour I was on was back in 2011 and got to go down into the Nickel Rim South mine when there was still a lot of construction going on. They were still developing. They were building an underground shop, and we're at this face, and they're going, yeah, so this is going to be where this massive, shop is going to be. And I'm looking at a wall of rock, going, okay, and they could sort of very clearly explain everything. And then, I learned a ton there. I saw so many more careers, so many more things sort of going on. I madly took notes. I went home after that first tour and I just saw all these little connections to everything else that I was teaching. Like, oh, I could talk about this here and in this grade 9 science and in this grade 10 science and in this grade 9 math. And as I did that, I would start creating these lessons and then get to a point and go, oh, I'm not really sure about this next part. So I started coming up with all these other things that I remember had been mentioned, but I didn't take good enough notes. So I decided, okay, I'm going back to fill in that knowledge. And so I went back again and, got to go to the same places that had completely changed because, it had been a year or whatever. And so got to go back to Nickel Rim South Mine and look at like the complete changes of the infrastructure and how that was operating and the different careers because they had sort of moved more into more production stuff. So there was more production and less infrastructure construction. And that was amazing. So I took a whole pile more notes and developed a whole pile more lessons. And then I started coming back and kind of sharing the lessons that I had come up with, the activities that I had come up, the way to sort of squeeze the mining and geoscience into what we actually teach. Because unfortunately, looking at the Ontario curriculum, we've kind of watered down and weaseled out a lot of earth sciences and sort of mining. It comes up very rarely explicitly in the curriculum. So I was kind of finding ways to wiggle it in. And then with all of that, I realized that I actually had a great service that I could do to these other teachers because I had been where they were, but I had kind of progressed. So I could kind of change the mining speak, if you will, into educator speak and show them different places where they could sort of sneak that in to what they're teaching. And so then I went back to another mine and then another one. And then as the mining tours develop, I got to go to a whole pile. Like I've been Nickel Rim South, Dome Mine. I've been in the Creighton Mine, down to the Snow Lab, Lac des Îles. I've been to Côté. I've been Malarctic. I've been at probably 4 or 5 mines in Timmins. Um, and so every time I go, there's something that just fascinates me that is new. And I've actually, over the last, I guess, 13, 14 years, seen how the progression of mines, because when we went to Nickel Rim South, that was like the newest mine, and the stuff that they were doing was amazing. And so I was excited about that. And then recently, the last couple of years, have been going to Côté, which is, again, a brand new mine that's opened up, and like the level of autonomous vehicles that they have, they've got like their ore trucks are completely autonomous, and that's just mind blowing. Of there's no drivers, and it's just constantly going, and it's so there's that aspect, and then the introduction of AI and other sort of forms of technology has been absolutely fascinating. It's been sort of really exciting. I just can't wait to come back and share that with my students.
What would our classrooms of the future look like if we could teach young people about mining and to see it not just as an industry, but also part of their story? One of the things we're focusing on within this season is origin stories. Like what is your origin story in mining? So how do you think the classrooms of the future would change if we could open young people's eyes to these potential career choices in mining?
So there's a bunch of different things that sort of I can see. So one of them is the fact that we have to stop teaching careers sort of in isolation. Like career teaching is in everything and every curriculum, right? But a lot of times it's this is this job. These are the requirements, and it's very, very much sort of isolated. The students basically are researching. They don't really have the exposure to people who actually do it. And so giving them the opportunity to hear from people who actually work in the industry, sort of from their viewpoint, rather than this sort of list of requirements that they are given in terms of teaching. And there's a number of opportunities that have come up with that. So there, for example, this podcast is fantastic because you've actually been able to, hear from people who work in different aspects. And so those experiences are great for the students to hear. So try it, and you said it true. It's all about the story. The students respond to stories rather than the content. So if we can deliver the content through that story, they will learn so much more. Like our sort of ancestors taught everything through stories. You look at sort of the space science for thousands and thousands of years, it was by telling stories about different things so that kids would retain the information. And so we do need to get back to that, to make the story. And it's the same as a lot of the other content that I do. Instead of, for example, in chemistry, instead of just giving them, hey, here is a chemical equation, balance it. There's no context, there's no story there. But I've flipped to sort of saying, here are a whole pile of different chemical reactions that occur in this stage of the processing of mining. So we start with this chemical in this form, and we extract it, so we get this. And the geologist or the chemist or whoever is doing this. And so by telling that story, it's funny, they're not doing as many questions, because they're reading that story, but they're making that connection in terms of where it comes from, the application, and it sort of sets it home as this is something that's real. This is something that someone actually does. And so I have seen that. Like I've heard students when they're like talking about studying, for example, or doing review, and they're like, oh, it was that thing where the guy did that thing, he crushed up that, he did this, he mixed it with carbon dioxide, and they make that through the story, not through, oh, that one time when I saw question number 4A that said, it's the story that makes the connection. So we do really need to do that and bring that out so that the students can actually make those connections, right? Talk to people, see people who actually do that. And that's one of the wonderful things that this podcast has done. I have been using it in my class to make connections to different careers. So thank you for that, by the way.
Well, listen, thank you for coming on and talking about your origin story, Rob, when it comes to teaching young people about mining. It's been a fascinating journey. especially to chat with someone who spends their days talking to young people. So thank you so much for joining us on This Is Mining.
Thank you.